They told him he was crazy until his actions stopped 14 attackers dead. Bomber crews would later report 14 separate attacking runs that were broken up or driven off by a single Mustang. What began as an act written off by his own squadron as reckless ended that day as a lesson in geometry, nerve, and the brittle calculus of survival in the air war over Europe. Winter 1943 had taught the 8th Air Force a cruel lesson. Daylight precision bombing was conceived as a hammer blow, massed formations of B-17 flying fortresses flying at altitude in rigid boxes, their defensive guns overlapping like the teeth of a comb. The doctrine assumed that concentrated fire and tight discipline would blunt fighter attacks. In practice, the Luftwaffe's tactics, especially head-on passes, and the simple limits of fighter escort range turned daylight raids into attrition. Long trips across the North Sea left escort fighters chasing back to base with fuel clocks ticking, while bomber streams, strung out and hampered by weather or navigation errors, became tempting, disjointed targets. Losses mounted. Crews who returned told of gaps in the formations and of the frightened suspension in which survival often hinged on split-second fate. Into that landscape stepped a pilot who did not think like many of his peers. James H. Howard was not a poster boy of reckless bravado. He was a craftsman in the air, a former flying tiger who had learned to read angles and closure speeds as naturally as others read a map. He had grown up in Canton, China, where early exposure to exotic places and hardened necessity shaped a temperament both patient and quietly resolute. He had flown with American volunteer group pilots before joining the Army Air Forces. Those years hardened more than technique. They honed a habit of thinking 3 moves ahead, of seeing the geometry in a dogfight. By January 11, 1944, Howard was in a P-51 Mustang attached to a fighter squadron tasked with long escort missions. The Mustang was a new tool in a desperate problem set. It could escort farther and faster than earlier fighters, but doctrine and fuel still constrained tactics. That morning, weather and timing conspired. The bomber stream that had set off toward Germany began to fragment. Navigation errors, cloud banks, and the enormous physical stress of formation flying left elements of the force out of mutual protection. Somewhere over the German interior, roughly 30 B-17s found themselves isolated, their mutual defensive net split and vulnerable. German fighters exploiting every opening fell upon them. This was not the graceful dogfight of cinema. It was a violent calculus of angles and closing speeds. Luftwaffe pilots, often flying Bf-109s and FW-190s, specialized in head-on attacks against the bombers.
A head-on pass compressed engagement time into terrifying slivers. An attacker could sweep past at tremendous relative speed, fire a devastating volley, and be gone before a full defensive response could be organized. For the bomber gunners who had to time their lead shots and trust thin panes of plexiglass, a single good pass could be deadly. The isolated B-17 group drew the attention of a force of German fighters preparing to make repeated passes. From the Mustang cockpit, Howard saw the geometry of the problem. A series of high-energy, high-risk intercepts that, if executed without interference, would shred the isolated formation. The correct textbook procedure, according to escort doctrine, was to stay with the main bomber stream, maintain throttle discipline, and preserve fuel for the return. A lone fighter peeling off toward an isolated group was a textbook violation. It meant engaging superior numbers, increasing the pilot's own risk of being cut off, and above all, burning fuel needed to get home. Howard made a different calculation. He saw a possibility in the facts the manuals ignored, namely the nature of head-on passes. Those attacks relied on momentum and the assumption that there was nothing in the path of the attacker but air and the bomber's thin skin. If a Mustang could be placed inside the bomber stream on the axis where attackers had to pass, the Mustang would become not only a threat but an obstacle. It was not about outgunning every opponent, it was about changing their decision calculus. An attacker mounted for a head-on pass who suddenly had to account for a nimble, well-armed fighter between his approach vector and the bomber would either overshoot, expose himself to concentrated defensive fire, or break off. In short, the presence of a Mustang in the wrong place could be a deterrent as effective as any single kill. He dove. The approach was audacious in its simplicity and unforgiving in execution. Howard pushed his Mustang down through layers of contrail and dispersed cloud, adjusting throttle and trim while the air pressure rose and the engine screamed against the cold. Inside the cockpit, the oxygen mask fogged at the edges, the instruments blurred with frost. His Mustang shuddered with each gust. He took a glance at the fuel gauge and noted it in the back of his mind. There were limits. He also timed his closure. Too soon and he would spoil the bomber formation, or worse, collide. Too late and the German fighters would be in on him. He lined up on the lead element and slipped in, becoming in effect a moving roadblock. What followed was not a single cinematic burst, but a series of short, brutal exchanges. German fighters launched run after run. Each approach was its own equation: angle of attack, speed differential, the relative bearing of bomber gunners.
Howard flew between attackers and B-17s, trading small, precise bursts of cannon and machine gun fire when openings presented, but more often, occupying the attacker's lane so that gunners, suddenly aided by a wingman in the wrong place, could bring deadly converging fire to bear. Tracers stitched the sky, rounds cracked and ricocheted across sheet metal. The air smelled faintly of burned cordite. For the bomber crews, who only moments before had felt abandoned, the sight of a Mustang slipping into their formation was like the sudden lighting of a lantern in a dark room. Each German pass that hit the Mustang's presence instead of the bomber cost the attacker something: a disrupted attack run, a diverted vector, sometimes a narrowly missed riposte from an alert gunner. Pilots who had planned to make a clean head-on pass now found themselves having to assess new risks. Some aborted early, peeling away under fire. Others overshot, presenting the defensive fire with a different profile and becoming visible targets for the B-17's overlapping gun arcs. Howard didn't need to down every plane. He needed to break the rhythm of the attackers. He needed to force them into the harder option, disengage. This pattern repeated. Over the course of roughly 30 minutes of high-intensity engagement, a long time in a single aircraft dogfight, bomber crews later estimated 14 separate attacking runs. Each one was met by the disruptive geometry of a Mustang that refused to quit the fight. Howard maneuvered not as a lone gladiator seeking kills, but as an instrument of denial, a tactical wedge that made certain attack vectors untenable. He timed short, precise cannon bursts and then repositioned, always calculating the fuel burn, always listening to the thin, insistent whine of the pumps and the ticking of his watch. Inside the bomber cockpits, the effect was transformational. Men who had been braced for the worst, some with hands white on the controls, others checking and tightening the belts that could be the last thing they grabbed, now found a new rhythm. Gunners learned quickly. When the Mustang slipped in ahead of a pass, the gunners would time longer, controlled bursts, swinging the massive machine guns into the new convergence points. The Mustang's mere presence changed how attackers were perceived. Instead of a clear lane to the bomber, there was now a gauntlet. But Germans, who depended on the speed and momentum of their passes, began to pay a price for each run. The cost for Howard was simple and severe. The more he engaged, the thinner his margins became. Fuel burned not only from throttle settings, but from the short, rapid energy maneuvers required to get into and out of attack lanes. Ammunition dwindled. The P-51's tanks, fine for long escort legs when flown conservatively, were not designed to support a half-hour of aggressive, repeated engagement deep over enemy territory.
At one point, Howard's radio traffic was sparse because there was little to send. What mattered was being where the fighters didn't expect a friend. Eventually, the fuel needle told the inevitable story. He had a dwindling reserve and a long glide back over the North Sea to England. But the immediate crisis was over. The German fighters had been repeatedly forced to abort or recompose their attacks upon contact with the Mustang, and the isolated B-17 element, bleeding but intact, began to reform and press on, joined finally by other escort elements drawn back by the same alarms that had alerted Howard. When the Mustang came back to England, it made a low, tense approach. Engines coughed and complained as fuel ran lean. The landing was one more act of careful calculation. Ground crews later inspected the aircraft and found traces of the violent, close work: splintered sheet metal, impact marks, and the worn barrels of guns. Howard had pushed his machine to the ragged edge and brought it home. He himself climbed out, hungry and exhausted, and faced the men who had spent half an hour watching a single and at first inexplicable decision. The immediate reactions were a tangle: admiration, relief, and for a moment puzzlement. Some squadron mates had earlier refused to believe he would peel off toward isolation. They had questioned his sanity, half in jest and half in the stunned disbelief that comes when a person acts outside the rulebook and the outcome is survival. Bomber crews, however, were unequivocal in their gratitude. In their debriefs and later reports, they described what they had seen: a Mustang that had entered their formation and refused to leave, blunting attack after attack. Intelligence officers compiled statements and cross-checked logs. The after-action picture that emerged was not of a man who had single-handedly shot down every attacker, but of a man whose presence and tactical placement had disrupted as many as 14 enemy attacking runs, saving perhaps dozens of lives and many aircraft from destruction. The institutional echo was immediate and slow at once. High command could not and did not simply codify a single man's improvisation into an instant doctrine. Military organizations are, by necessity, conservative. They prefer replicable procedures to ad hoc heroics. Yet the logic of Howard's gamble, The idea that positioning and deterrence are as important as pure firepower penetrated debates about escort tactics. Pilots and commanders began to incorporate more aggressive close-in escort techniques to reward initiative when the situation demanded it, and to study the conditions under which a small formation or a lone fighter could act as a force multiplier by changing enemy behavior rather than trying to match enemy numbers. Howard's action eventually became one of those stories that has both technical and moral value.
On the technical side, it illustrated a practical counter to head-on passes, place disruptive small elements where attackers expect a vacuum, and make the cost of the pass intolerable. On the moral side, it showed the way calm analysis and steady courage can combine. Howard did not roar into the fight because of anger or longing for glory. He computed, he judged risk, and he accepted personal danger as the price for denying the enemy an easy vector. Recognition followed, but not in the way a man might expect. The Medal of Honor, awarded later, acknowledged not an inflated tally of enemy aircraft downed, but the undeniable fact that his actions saved lives and altered the course of a mission when doctrine had not provided the right answer. The official citation and contemporaneous narratives emphasized his calculated bravery and the extraordinary circumstances under which he operated. More importantly, the crews who had looked into the teeth of the German assault and then home at the sight of a Mustang that would not quit told the real story. A single decision had multiplied into survival for many. That day, the Luftwaffe learned a lesson too. Risk-reward calculations that seemed favorable when plotting head-on runs now had to be rethought. The psychological effect of a fighter who would insert himself into a bomber stream changed attackers' willingness to commit to the clean, fast runs they preferred. Over time, as Mustangs and other long-range fighters became more common, and as escort doctrine evolved, German pilots could no longer assume isolated bomber elements were sitting targets. The aftershocks reached beyond tactics. Stories of Howard's actions circulated among crews and squadrons. They became part of the Air War's folklore, a parable of how one measured risk can save many. The narrative that emerged was not a simple tale of glory. It was a reminder that war often rewards careful calculation as much as courage. Young pilots read the reports and learned two things: that initiative within a command structure can matter, and that imagination applied to the problem of survival can be decisive. It is tempting to reduce the episode to a single dramatic line: a lone pilot saved 30 bombers. That is not wrong as a shorthand, but the fuller truth is more instructive. Howard did not act from blind daring. He acted because he apprehended the geometry of attack and defense, because he weighed the fuel numbers against the tactical payoff, and because he was willing to accept narrow personal risk to protect crews who otherwise had no immediate defense. His decision fused intellect and courage in a way that an instruction manual never could. In the weeks and months that followed, veterans of that mission told their stories in mess halls and at bayside gatherings. They spoke of a Mustang slipping into their formation like a promise.
They spoke of rounds that had passed between wings, of the sudden focused fire of gunners who finally had a margin to aim, and, above all, of men who got to fly home because one pilot refused to leave. James H. Howard lived long enough to see the war end and to carry with him the quiet burden of what it means to have made a choice that sent others home. The Medal of Honor formally recognized his action, but the deeper legacy was tactical and cultural, a reinforced appreciation for initiative, a shift toward recognizing denial and deterrence as valid tactics, and an enduring image for aviators of how the right move at the right time can change an equation that once seemed hopeless. History often asks a simple, relentless question: what does one person's choice matter? On January 11, 1944, a Mustang pilot answered that question with a sequence of precise, risky maneuvers that interrupted enemy plans and protected vulnerable men in a 30-odd B-17 formation. The bomber crew's estimate of 14 attacking runs, broken up, driven off, or made useless by that Mustang's presence, stands as the factual core behind a headline that demands drama. The headline is true in spirit, even as the specifics require nuance. He did not necessarily shoot down 14 aircraft with his guns, but he did stop 14 attacking runs, and by doing so, helped bring crews home. What remains is the picture of that cockpit: a pilot, alone and deliberate, solving a dynamic problem faster than the manual could, and bearing the consequences of that choice in burned fuel and spent ammunition. The lesson is not a paean to recklessness, but a study in the measured use of risk for the protection of others. When institutions are slow to change, sometimes the field teaches the doctrine. Howard's action did both. It saved lives in a single harrowing mission,
and it nudged the larger system toward more flexible thinking. If this story resonates with you, if you want more accounts of wartime turning points where calculation and courage collide, tap like and subscribe. There are more histories like this that show how small, decisive acts reshaped battles and minds. In the end, the image that lingers is not of a tally of enemy planes, but of 30 men in battered B-17s finding in the cold sky over enemy territory a tiny, bright shape that refused to leave them to their fate. That refusal turned threat into retreat and doctrine into a lesson learned the hard way. James H. Howard's legacy is not only a medal in a case, it is a reminder that logic and bravery together can rewrite what seems inevitable. Which would you have chosen in his place? The safety of the known rulebook, or the dangerous possibility that your single decision could bring 30 men home? Share your thoughts below and pass this story on to someone who appreciates the hard choices behind history.